So hi everyone, this is Laura at Teaching Leaders, and we're going to start the webinar in about 3 minutes time. Hopefully you'll all be able to hear me, but if anybody can't, there's a questions facility on the webinar software, so feel free to type a comment in that box to either let us know that you can or you can't hear us, and we'll be back in 3 minutes. Speak to you soon. Hi everyone, this is Laura at Teaching Leaders. I'm hoping that you can hear me okay. If anybody is having any troubles with the sound or connecting to the webinar, there's a question facility on the webinar software, so do just type a question in that box and let me know if you're having any trouble connecting. Otherwise, we're just waiting for a few more participants and we'll look to start in a couple of minutes' time.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, okay, this is Laura at Teaching Leaders. Welcome to the webinar today. We're going to start in a couple of minutes time. We're expecting a couple more attendees, so do bear with us and we'll look to start in 1 to 2 minutes. If anyone has any questions or is having any trouble connecting to the webinar software, do just type in the question facility box and we'll be able to see that come up here. Okay everyone, we'll make a start now. You're very welcome to the webinar and thanks for joining us today. The first and most important thing to say after that is that we have a question box facility, so useful to use to let us know if you have any technological difficulties throughout and you can't hear us well or anything, but also great if you have any questions whilst the webinar is taking place. So if you do have any questions, we'll be managing those and sort of responding to you as we go through, so do do type away, and we'll be watching for those. I'm now going to introduce David Weston, who is giving this webinar today, and he is the Chief Executive of the Teacher Development Trust. So David, thank you very much for being here with us today. It's great to have you, and my colleague Elise will be managing the questions, so I'm going to hand over to David just now. I hope you enjoyed the webinar.
Thank you very much, Laura, and hello everybody. I hope you can all hear me okay. As has been said, if you've got any questions, please do pop them in the question box, and we'll be monitoring those and I can get back to you. So today's session is around whole school professional development and looking at how we develop systems and approaches that are really effective for changing what happens in your school. So the outcomes for today, the first thing, I suppose the most important thing is actually point 2 really, to develop an understanding of what really makes great professional development. And when we say great professional development, what we're really talking about is the sort of professional development that ultimately helps students and young people succeed, but also helps your teachers really thrive in the workplace. But it's got to do the two things. So in order to identify, once we've identified what that great professional development is, then another outcome from today is understanding how you assess the needs so that you can work out the sorts of approaches that will be most effective. Also, then understanding how to evaluate that effectiveness. And then finally, because you are working with your fellows, then how can you use them? How can you use them to facilitate really effective professional development? So I'm going to be drawing upon the Teacher Development Trust's research in this area. There have been some big international reviews over the past couple of decades, and in fact in September we commissioned a new international systematic review of what works in professional development. Hasn't actually been released yet, but some of the things I talked to you about today are sort of a sneaky peek at some of those findings, and you can look out for the publication of that document next month. So a few questions for you to consider. The first thing is, how many of you have spent time trying to improve your teaching? Now obviously I'm not going to ask people to actually do votes at this point. Broadly speaking, I guess most people would acknowledge that's something you've tried to do. How many of you have been on courses to improve your teaching? Well, again, that's the sort of thing which broadly the most people will say, I've been on courses. And then finally, many people, how many of you have read printed advice or books? That also tends to be the large majority that people I speak to. So typically speaking, when I'm doing this session live, then we get 99% of people have done all those three things. And that's no surprise, because actually all the research shows that the primary way that teachers in schools and indeed other professional colleagues receive professional development is through fairly passive activities. So listening to presentations, possibly having a discussion, but very little of actually trying things out. So here's a few more questions to really reflect on. The first one is, have you ever watched a program about cooking? I'm guessing most people probably have. This is one of those things which even when I'm doing a live session, occasionally people don't admit they've actually done this, and then I have to look at them really and say, even if your partner's been watching it, if you've been watching Great British Menu or something like that, have you ever learned a new idea or recipe technique? Again, that's a very common thing to do. Lots of people will have these shows on, whether you chose to watch it or not, and you'll learn something new. But the really interesting question for me, given how many people are watching these shows, is how many people genuinely stop cooking the way they used to cook. You know, stop coming home, sticking some pasta in the pan and having a really quick meal, and now systematically do higher quality cooking, eat better. And this is a really interesting thing, because despite the fact that there are, if you ask most people, they would be quite interested in improving the way they cook and having higher quality meals, more nutrition, etc. We're motivated. We watch these shows which are beautifully produced. They're really exciting. They show the science in really accessible ways. They demonstrate techniques. They've got step-by-step ideas. Many people, in fact, have then ideas linked to those, like books and podcasts and all these sorts of things. But very few people actually change their habits. And if you can compare and contrast that to what's happening in schools, where a large number of people are sat in a hall on a twilight inset, and they're probably not hugely excited about the particular priority that's been chosen for them, and they're going to have a one-off session, and that's supposed to change these deeply ingrained habits which all of us use in the classroom. So when you compare and contrast cooking to teacher professional development, it becomes reasonably clear. It's a good way of illustrating that we have a bit of an issue in the way that we typically do professional development in schools. So here is what I would sort of call a teacher development impact pyramid. So at the top we've got the things that are pretty easy to do, and at the bottom are the things that are actually very hard to get. So we know, whether it's through a webinar like this, or whether it's reading a book, or whether it's listening to a really interesting speaker, you can become aware of new things very easily. And I would have thought today you're very likely to become aware of a new practice. If I'm being very persuasive, you might even believe me that what I'm saying is a good idea. However, not necessarily everybody will have the time to actually make some changes in your practice. For some of you, maybe there'll be a little tweak, something small that you could change. It's even less likely you'll have the time and the space to really develop these ideas and adopt it across the whole school. That it's a systematic approach using the information you've had, and not just systematizing it, but then becoming deeply skillful with it, and something where everybody's habits actually change as a result of these new systems. And obviously systematizing something is quite hard. Making it so that this becomes a habit for everybody is even harder. It turns out it's even harder still to change habits in such a way that students actually benefit. And there's quite a lot of research now that shows that a lot of the effort we've put in the last decade or so to changing the way that teachers practice has potentially changed what we see in the classroom, but really hasn't had as much impact on student outcomes as we'd really like to see. So then we can flip things around. What does the research tell us is the sort of process that is going to actually help students? So these are ways that teachers can develop where students are actually likely to benefit. So this is, I've described it here as an impact-focused inquiry process. And this is the sort of process where we begin by identifying the outcomes we'd like for students. Now that's really important. The research shows us quite clearly that if we start a development activity for teachers without being clear which particular students are going to benefit and in which particular way, we're unlikely to achieve that. In particular, the more specific we can be about the benefits and which students, the more likely it is we'll achieve them. So for example, if we say all children in year 11 will increase their maths GCSE result by a grade, for example, that's very, very broad indeed, and we might aim for it, but it's very hard to actually work out what the actual issue is that's stopping them from increasing that grade. Whereas if we say, perhaps look at year 6 children, and this time we're going to look at boys who are eligible for free school meals, and we're going to look at the way that their fluency of spoken English during history lessons, for example. It's something much more specific. We've got a very specific group of students, and by really focusing on that at the very beginning, it is much more likely that the whole process is going to have impact, not only on those students, but actually more widely. So this is the first finding. The very first thing we need to do is identify the valued student learning outcomes at the very beginning. Now I've said learning, it could be behavior. We could identify a particular problem behavior. But we need to do that at the beginning of every teacher development activity, as it makes it easier to evaluate and more likely will have impact. Just to remind you, please do use the question facility as I'm going along. I'm very happy to be interrupted at any time if you've got any questions, and can deal with those as we go along. So this impact-focused inquiry process starts by identifying what it is we'd like to see. We then move on to try and understand what is the issue underlying that outcome. Why haven't we achieved that outcome? So for example, if you're seeing a behavioral issue, then rather than making an assumption, well, I think these children aren't behaving because, it's important to then understand a little bit more deeply what's the actual barrier for the students. What's the actual barrier perhaps that the teacher is experiencing in trying to help those students? What we often find at this stage is that teachers, for example, will go in with an idea that, oh, well, this student doesn't pay attention, the student, their attention wanders, this student has a very short attention span. I can think of an example recently where a teacher went in and looked at one of these processes with that idea in order to improve behaviour of a specific student. And actually, after a bit of diagnostic work, they discovered they were being horribly distracted by the student next door. At that point, it was fairly obvious that all they really needed to do was change the seating plan, and actually there was nothing more than that. But it's really important for teachers to grapple with what are the actual barriers for students for the outcomes I'm trying to achieve. The more they can do that, the more they can understand the learning process, the more likely it is their practice will improve. Through doing that, you also understand where you're starting from. Well, once you've identified the outcome you're looking for, and you've identified the barriers that are standing in the way of students, then you can understand where you're starting from now, so that as you go through the process, you can see whether those barriers are decreasing. If you, for example, did some interviews with students near the beginning of the process, or if you engaged with doing some surveys, or perhaps you looked at examples of work in exercise books, if these are the approaches you use to diagnose the real problems initially, you can use those formatively through the process and keep observing those same measures as you go through the process of teacher learning to identify whether you're having the impact that you want to have. Once you've identified your outcome, once you've identified what the actual barrier is, you can then go to experts, you can go to colleagues, you can read research, you can go to the Teaching Leaders Leadership Library, you can go to all sorts of different areas to identify strategies to actually help the teachers move forward at that stage. Because, as I said before, once you really understand what you're trying to achieve and what the issues are in the way of that, it's actually much easier to identify what the problems are and what the strategies are that you need to use. It's then really important that teachers work together to solve problems. We need teachers who are identifying barriers, constantly refining their practice to overcome those barriers, constantly going back to the theory and the research and the experts and saying, how can I do this even better? But the whole process of working together through this process really helps teachers improve their practice more effectively and helps them evaluate the impact. And the evaluation of impact is primarily for those teachers who are involved to constantly check, have they made the difference yet to the students for the particular issues they identified. So this process is very, very different to what we typically see in schools, where we typically see people who want to share information, they've got some information they want to communicate, they have practices they'd like teachers to adopt or perhaps even mimic. And the research is fairly clear that actually that is not an effective way of changing teacher practice in a sustained way so that children actually benefit. So if we look at what the research actually tells us in this area, the research identifies a number of elements which need to be there for really effective teacher development. So the first thing, I've already talked about this idea that it's collaborative and it's iterative. So the idea that teachers are working together and they repeatedly identify, refine and solve problems. So problem solving together through sort of experimentation turns out to be a vital feature of all effective teacher development. The next thing, as I've already mentioned, is it needs to be focused on outcomes for pupils. If all you try to do is say, for example, this teacher doesn't appear to be very good at feedback, let's try and improve their practice at feedback, what the teacher does is become very self-reflective about their own practice, but they stop thinking so much about the impact they're actually having on the students in front of them. Whereas if you start by identifying issues in learning that the students are having, and then pick feedback to improve, then the teachers stay focused on the outcome. They sort of keep their eyes on the prize, if you will. So we stay focused on outcomes for pupils, collaboratively experimenting and refining practice together. And by doing so, this becomes something where you're discussing and theorizing about what needs to happen, but then trying it out. Then we go back again to the theory and discussion, and then once again go back into the classroom and try things out. And by sustaining and iterating this process over quite a long time, then teachers are much more likely to make improvements. We've noticed in all the research that it's really important that teachers don't just come up with ideas themselves. If you really want to help people move forward, you need somebody who will help them move forward, who has some more expert specialist expertise. It's the reason why we put children in classrooms, so that they're able to access the specialist expertise of the teacher. And it's the same process when teachers are developing. If they can work with someone more experienced and more understanding of the knowledge base than them, that will be really helpful. But not so they're just trying to please that person, but so that they can constantly monitor their own improvement and evaluate their impact on the students they identified. Take all these things together. It's a very challenging process, because you can't simply understand an idea and say, great, I've got that, I'm going to do it. You're never happy until you've actually made the difference to the students. So here, this is all quite theoretical, this framework that shows what the sorts of things that are needed. But what I'm going to do now is give you some practical examples where we sort of score them against these ideas and understand how we can improve typical processes we see in schools so that they are they're more aligned to this sort of approach. I know we've had a couple of people who've arrived just as we've been starting the webinar, so just to reiterate, if you do have questions or comments, really keen for you to use the question facility in the software and put those questions to me. I've got a colleague from Teaching Leaders who will be keeping an eye on those and making sure I don't miss them, so do please keep putting your questions in as we go. Okay, so this is a little bit of an activity for you, and this is where I'm really keen for people to give me a little bit of feedback. So what I've put here is an example of going on a one-day course on the Pupil Premium. I've picked out this because it's now a very common, perhaps slightly fashionable thing. In our charity, we see lots of people engaging in these sorts of activities. And what I want to do is then consider, how does that compare to the ideal scenario? So what I'm asking you to think about here is, let's imagine a teacher who has said, I've been told I need to go on this course on the Pupil Premium. They're sent away, they go on the course, they listen to what's going on, maybe they pick up materials, they come back, and then they just carry on with their day job. Okay, so that's the sort of scenario we're thinking about. And what I've done here is create a table where on the left-hand side I've talked about all the different ideas we just talked through. So we're asking, to what extent is the teacher collaborating in ongoing improvement together with other colleagues when they're going on this one-day course? And in the next column, I'd like you to think, would you put a 0, a 1, or a 2? 0, that doesn't happen at all for this teacher going on the one-day course. Or maybe it happens a bit, in which case 1, or maybe it happens a lot, in which case 2. Is this particular experience for the teacher, is it focused on specific valued outcomes for specific pupils? Yes, if it is, definitely give it a 2, if not, give it a 0, and you can choose a 1 if it's between, and so on. Is it practical, is it sustained, does it draw on specialist expertise? So I'm just going to pause for a moment. I'm going to encourage you, I know it's at the end of your workday, but I'm going to encourage people to put some feedback in through the messaging or questions facility, and suggest which of these categories would this experience do well on. So would it do well in collaborating together, or is it good because it's sustained, or is it good because it's challenging? Which of these areas do you think this would be particularly good at, sending a teacher on a one-day course? So you should be able to click on the questions feature, type in what you think there, and I'd be really grateful if someone is feeling brave and can put that in. I accidentally just revealed my own answers. Okay, I can see people haven't. I can't see any questions at the moment, so I'm assuming. Right. No, I do have one here. Okay, so let's have a look on the. So it draws on specialist expertise. Yes, absolutely. You'd hope so, wouldn't you? You'd really hope that this is a course where there is an expert involved. Although, let's face it, we've all been on courses where the person doesn't appear to know what they're talking about. Someone else has said, I think it'd be good for specialist input, but not sustained. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that it certainly wouldn't be a very sustained experience. And we have, again, drawing on external specialist expertise. So you're all in agreement with each other. Thank you very much. Now, your scores might be different, and it really doesn't matter if your scores are, because we all have a different experience in our heads. The particular experience in my head these are the scores that I gave it. I'm quite a harsh marker, as you'll see. So from my point of view, even though there may have been some conversation on the course, and possibly that person may come back to school and discuss it with other people, there isn't any meaningful collaboration in actually improving practice. So I've given it a 0 for that. Is it focused on specific pupils? Well, there is a vague focus here on all children who are eligible for free school meals, the ever 6 category as we call them, but it really is a very huge group, and actually we're not talking about specific pupils, and we haven't said which outcome. We haven't even said which subject it's in. Is it practical? No, absolutely not. You're simply listening to theory. So there's lots of engagement with theory, but it really doesn't score well on the combination of both. Not sustained at all, completely one-off experience. Does it draw on external specialist expertise? Well, we're hoping so. There's probably no evaluation built in. I don't know about you, but most courses you go on tend to say, did you enjoy this? What would you like to see next time? How could we do it better? That's not really evaluating actual outcomes for students, though, so I'm giving it a 0 for that. Is it challenging? I'm going to be generous here and say perhaps they said some things that made you really think. Maybe it was even very challenging. I don't think it could ever get more than a 1 because you never get a chance to try it out and succeed or fail. So I've given it 3.5 out of 14. Really, this is not well aligned with the ideas of what research would suggest is likely to make a big change. However, if we think of each of those ideas, let's take that same idea of going on a one-day course, but this time think, well, what could we do to actually make that significantly better? So the first thing I'm going to suggest is that before anybody goes on a course, let's get a small team of teachers together who spend some time diagnosing the specific issues for children who are eligible for free school meals and identify particular students which they're worried about. Having done that baseline work, perhaps there's 3 teachers who've done that together, one of them now goes on the course armed with specific children in mind, some specific learning barriers they've seen. They note particularly the points that are relevant. Perhaps they have an opportunity to speak to some of the speakers and facilitators and ask some questions that challenge about those particular students. Once they bring back that knowledge, the teachers then work together by planning lessons together with each other which use some of those ideas. They may plan those lessons, perhaps they'll take some video, perhaps one of them will pop into the other person's lesson, and they'll really discuss how effectively this knowledge that they've retrieved from this course, how effective that is now actually in practice. And some of the things will surprise them, some of the things will work, some won't, but they'll reflect and they'll refine what they're doing, constantly looking at the source material that they gathered on the course. Because they started by identifying the barriers, they're now constantly able to check with those specific students, are we seeing, for example, those particular questions in maths, or are we seeing this behavior improving, or are we seeing attendance improving? So they can constantly check, having identified the outcomes they want, are we being effective at overcoming those barriers? So it's really formative for them. Everything they do helps them tweak and refine what they're doing. And hopefully they either can go on another similar course, or even better, they took some business cards from some of the speakers, they dropped them some emails, maybe they even arrange some external input, someone coming and visiting, or a Skype session, and they talk about, this is what we've been doing, these are the current problems we're having, this is what we thought you meant when you said this, but actually it's not working or it is working. Now think about that process. It still has one teacher going on one of these one-off inputs, but it's a completely different process. It's now turned into an impact-focused inquiry type process. And if we think about the scoring here, well, it won't surprise you that actually it's, oh, sorry, wrong slide. It won't surprise you to know that actually this is likely to score much, much more highly. So we're really looking at much more collaboration, much more focus, much more support, much more challenge. The only thing it might not be as good at, potentially, is having the expertise sustained throughout the process. So in an ideal world, you get some expert input from someone and they are working more closely with you as you go through the process. But broadly, you can immediately see this is much more likely to have impact. You can also see it takes a lot more time, but the investment of time of somebody going away for that day is embedded much more effectively. Here's another example, which I've seen in quite a few primary schools in particular, where they maybe have a numeracy and literacy lead. And what that person goes around to do is every half term they'll pop in on each teacher, they'll do a lesson observation in their own area, so the numeracy lead will watch a lesson on numeracy and maths, and they will then have a look at the books together and then give that teacher some feedback. So this sort of subject leader monitoring, book scrutiny, etc., how effective would that be, do you think, in terms of the sorts of categories we've talked about? Where would it score well? Where might it not score so well? So again, if I can encourage you to use that same feedback facility with the questions, and then I can see what you're thinking around where this might be good or not. And again, we might have disagreements here. Not everybody will think the same good areas or less good areas, but it's useful if you can give me a sense of where do you think this would be good, where do you think this would be less good, and any other general reflections that you have. So if you could use that feedback facility, and just waiting for, see if we can get a few answers. Okay, so we've got someone who said it's likely to be very challenging and supportive. Yeah, it could well be quite challenging, couldn't it? So Sharon's just said challenging and supportive, depending, hopefully good for specialist input, should be part of a collaborative process. Yes, and that's key, isn't it? I mean, the sort of relationship here is going to be very, very important, isn't it? Thank you, Sharon. Anybody else? It can be sustained and iterative, says Helen. Thank you. Just see if anyone else has got any. Okay, so let's have a look. And again, I'm drawing on an example I saw in a particular school recently. And the scoring, which I've given it here, is a lot of ones. And the reason I've said that is because a lot of it really depends on the sort of relationship. So in the particular process which I observed, there was a bit of peer working in as much as you had a conversation, but actually it was very judgmental. It really wasn't supposed to be developmental. It was very much, this is how good you are in order to be sort of less bad, or in order to move up to the next notch on the checkbox, then you need to do this. There was a vague focus on, for example, maths, but no, it wasn't on specific pupils. Certainly people did get to try out the feedback and then come back again, but actually that might be too long. I mean, in maths, as a maths teacher myself, you don't spend a whole term teaching one topic, so actually it might be a different topic next time, so that could be different. You never know, you might find this enjoyable. I have to say, it wasn't something that particularly appealed to me. I thought I'd be a little bit unlucky to have that process happening to me a lot. So it might be sustained, maybe not hugely sustained. If we're lucky, the person internally is an expert. If we're unlucky, they don't know what they're talking about, and I've seen examples of both of those in schools. There is examples of evaluation here, aren't there? It's kind of related to the person coming in. They're making the evaluation. What I described and what I remember seeing in this particular school didn't have a huge amount where the teacher themselves was evaluating what they're doing. It probably was very challenging, but not necessarily in a good way, but I gave it the benefit of the doubt and said, well, there is certainly regular challenge and support here. So again, we can see how these principles can be applied to quite a few different processes which are supposed to improve the way that teachers develop. And again, this is not perfect. It's not ideal in the way that it's set up. So now I want to introduce you to the idea of lesson study. And I know we've got I'm doing another session in a little while on lesson study specifically, but I just wanted to introduce the idea. And lesson study is a collaborative process where a triad of teachers are likely to be working together to solve a specific problem together. And it's very much like the cycle I talked to you about earlier in this presentation, when it starts off with teachers planning a lesson together, having identified a goal. They pick 2 or 3 specific pupils they're going to really focus on in their planning and their observation. It's a lesson for everybody, but they'll really focus on 2 or 3. They'll sort of zoom in on them in their thinking. The key part of planning is that the group of teachers are planning to do this lesson together. One of them might teach it, but it really is a joint effort. And secondly, they're very much focused on how they predict each activity will impact on their chosen pupils. That's a really important discussion because it really makes you think theoretically, what do I know about this student? What do I know about how students develop more generally? What do I know about the barriers for these students? And how will my pedagogy, will my activities, will my relationship with that student have a bearing on what's likely to happen? We also know, just generally psychologically, if you make a prediction about something, you're more likely to pay attention to what happens and indeed learn from something afterwards. It's one of those nice little psychological tricks. So secondly, here's the lesson. One of us in the group will teach it. Doesn't matter if it doesn't work perfectly because we all planned it together, so actually nobody's going to feel bad. Nobody does any Ofsted style judgments. In fact, I would suggest banning the words outstanding, good, requires improvement, and unsatisfactory or inadequate completely. So one of you will teach the lesson. Anyone else in the room, either at the time or if you video it, will watch back later, really focusing on those one or two students and whether their reactions were as expected. And then really importantly, looking at the work they're producing, looking at any tests that they do, looking at any activities that they do, and talking to those students. And often the talking to the students is the most important part. And at the end of the process, as soon after that lesson as humanly possible, given our busy days it's very hard, but as soon as possible, even better, actually in that same classroom, the students leave and everybody has a conversation. It's really good to be in that same classroom because you can point and reenact what happened to the students and how they were interacting. But broadly, reflect how did what we hoped to achieve and how did what we think would happen relate to what actually happened. If this process is combined with some sort of expert coach who can give some really good ideas, maybe help interpret what's been happening, this can be an extremely powerful process. And when we look at the scoring for this sort of idea, it's mainly 2s. It really aligns itself well with the research that we see on effective professional development. One single cycle of planning, observing and reflecting is not necessarily as sustained as we really like it to be. If you pick a tiny, tiny little issue you're having in your class, it might only take one cycle to deal with it. If it's a really big issue, how we're improving the whole of literacy, then you will definitely need more cycles. As I said, it will work really well if you're drawing on a specialist expert, someone who feels a little bit different out of the sort of the normal team that those teachers are working in. So if you're in a very big school, potentially someone from a very different department who has real expertise in the area could be helpful. In an ideal world, there'd be someone from another school or an expert, possibly drawing on research, but even better, working with someone who has real in-depth knowledge of that research. So that's lesson study. So to draw this together, these are the sorts of activities we're really looking for to really understand how this then translates into really exceptional schools. We see these same ideas manifest themselves in schools which are doing really exceptionally well. So when Cure, that's the Centre for the Use of Research in Evidence and Education, when Cure did some research for Teach First in 2013, and they looked at the difference between schools in very disadvantaged areas where children were either continually doing exceptionally well versus doing merely quite well, they found that the schools where students were doing exceptionally well had much more coaching and mentoring. They were much more consistent, they were much more evidence-based, they were much more keen to develop cross-curricular strategies, although that might be particularly typical to schools in disadvantaged areas. There was a lot more of this collaborative professional learning. They made more use of internal expertise, but also there was a higher buy-in. They invested more in external expertise as well. Subject knowledge is more important rather than simply generic approaches to improving teaching. Everybody wanted to improve teaching in particular topics, in particular subjects. It was the gradual improvement approach where rather than try and take a blanket approach to generically improve everything, you start picking off the difficult issues one by one. So it really maps well. Okay, does anyone have any questions at this point which you'd like to ask about what you've seen so far? We've talked about the characteristics of really effective professional development. And what I'll go on to do in the next section is talk about how you might actually identify the sorts of needs in your school and put together your program of professional development, but also how you might evaluate that, its impact, and how you might use some of your fellows in order to facilitate that process. So does anyone have any questions at this stage that they'd like to ask? Cure. Okay, what is Cure? Cure is the Centre for the Use of Research and Evidence in Education. It's a huge mouthful. If you just search for CUREE, then you should find their website. You can also find, I believe, links to some of their research from the Teacher Development Trust website, which I'll show you at the end as well. I think these slides are also likely to be uploaded to the library, so you should be able to find them if you're not sure. So thanks for that question. Does anyone else have any other questions at this stage? Just pause just for a moment, or if you have any reflections. Okay, I can see some. Yes, hello.
Hello. Can you hear me? It's Elise here, the Associate Director from the South Programs.
Hi, Elise.
Just hi. It's really interesting. I just wanted to flag up if people are interested in seeing the slides on the Leadership Academy, that your fellows will have access to this. So you will need to ask your fellows to show you the slides and to download them for you, because they're the only ones with access.
That's an important point. Thank you. Okay, so I think that's all the questions we had at the moment. We had someone with a hand raised. No. Okay, right. So as I say, please do continue to feedback questions and ideas as we go into the next section, and we'll talk about some of these other areas as well. Okay, so needs analysis. Now, this is very complicated. We've been mapping this at the Teacher Development Trust and thinking, what are all the different drivers that cause professional development leaders to think about what's going to be in their program for the year? And it's very complicated. So actually we see all sorts of different things. I've put in red some of the things which are very common, although we're very keen to see reduced. So these are the sorts of things which, broadly speaking, will often lead to very non-sustained, non-systematic approaches to professional development. But all these different things are pressures that must be considered when planning out the CPD program for the year. What I've put in green are the elements which are often really underplayed and absolutely need to be prioritized. So even though there are huge amounts of professional development and learning that need to be done around statutory requirements, and I know anyone in a senior leadership team has colleagues coming to them all the time with ideas they want to do, and of course we all have to deal with change, the more we can encourage teachers themselves to diagnose learning issues that are in front of them in their classes, in their departments, in their teams, the more they can do that, and that is led directly to their professional learning, the more likely we are to see professional learning which is going to make a difference. Now that sometimes means, in the same way that I gave you an example of taking a one-off course and turning it into something that could be really impactful by adding an inquiry process around it, by adding this sort of experimentation and inquiry around it in groups, we may need to do some of the same things. Now, of course, some activities, the outcome you're looking for will simply be awareness, and we know in schools communication is a real big issue. And typically speaking, emails are overused, so people pay less attention to them. There's a huge temptation to want to have several briefings a week, subject leaders and team leaders to have as many meetings as possible to simply tell people what they think they need to know. However, there is without any doubt the schools that are most successful at professional development are absolutely brutal at reducing this time. They're really ruthless, reducing it to one big staff briefing a week, which is much shorter, which is much more collaborative and focused on certain themes which they bring back again and again. When they look at how teams use their time in subject teams or pastoral teams or any of these other sorts of groups, they really drive them to reduce the amount of admin. Now that means a lot of cultural change, and actually it can be very scary as a leader, I know full well, to not just start broadcasting ideas out because you want people to know things, but the more we can put them in charge of looking at sustained themes through the year, the better. Now, of course, that's incredibly hard when new ideas are being thrown at schools all the time, but that's the sort of process which we think is really important. Ultimately, it comes down to identifying the intended impact of every single activity in your CPD program, and if possible, a specific student learning or behavioral outcome. Now, of course, there are some things around career development, for example, somebody who is preparing to move into a middle leadership position, they need to understand how to impact on colleagues. There is no directly intended impact necessarily on student outcomes. But as we can see from the Teaching Leaders Programme, even career development work can have a strong element of focus on student outcomes. Why do they do that? Because it's much more likely that those people will have impact on student outcomes if they know what they're trying to change initially. Similarly, we also see schools who plan in teacher well-being sessions. Given how incredibly rare and wonderful these moments of inset and CPD really are, then we need to take them as much as possible for this wonderful collaborative sort of work. Now, the evidence shows that when you really give teachers autonomy, if you strip away some of the bureaucratic work that they often have to do and some of the things they don't feel are helpful to them, and you do get them to work on these sorts of inquiry approaches, actually that's incredibly positive for well-being. So we've seen in many cases where we get very high levels of well-being in schools simply because staff feel they're listened to, they're not being overburdened, they really feel they're being treated as professionals. Their well-being is being thought about, but not necessarily addressed directly through interventions on using inset. So those are some of the key ideas. So if I can encourage you when thinking about your drivers of why you're doing every activity in your CPD program, I think the more you can focus it on what do students need, what do teachers believe students need, what do experts working with teachers believe students need, the more helpful it is. And the more granular you can be, the better. Actually, broadly speaking, nobody got into teaching because we wanted to, achieve our Fisher Family Trust targets or get 3 levels of progress. It's not very inspiring. If you say to someone, think of a topic where maybe last year's cohort didn't do quite so well, do question-by-question analysis of some of your exams, of your tests, and identify what are the things that you think, yeah, I can do better at that this year. And that's a much more granular idea, which relates much more to what teachers are broadly interested in. And of course, that will feed directly into improved results, because you would hope to see when that question or topic appears in the next exam, then the results will improve. But it's much easier to then evaluate impact. So that's the sort of the needs analysis. It's an incredibly complicated process. And broadly speaking, as a CPD leader, we find time and again CPD leads are not given a large enough budget. They're not given enough time. Bear in mind, there are schools there who make huge investments in professional development. If we look at, for example, Cramlington Learning Village in Newcastle, where they spend 2 hours every single week in protected professional development time. Now, that's only been done with a huge amount of buy-in from teachers. It's been gradually developed. They've made some tough decisions about the amount of curriculum time and contact time. They've made some tough budget choices in order to enable that to happen. But they've really prioritized professional learning at the very top of what they do. And what we tend to see is strong career development in that school and other schools who are doing similar things. I'd be interested if you'd like to give me some feedback through the questions, whether anyone else has moved in that direction, because I know it is increasingly popular. So the ideal drivers we're looking for really starts with, what do we really want for our learners? What's the sort of curriculum we believe we're really trying to help them learn and understand and value? This is an important starting point. Where we see CPD as something that's often not enjoyed, we see schools who are driven, it is fairly clear, even if it's what they claim they're not doing, driven away from Ofsted fear or driven by accountability measures. And again, that's very quickly picked up by staff, and we frequently see lower morale. We see people with much less buy-in because they don't really see the worth of it apart from helping somebody else, apart from making somebody else happy. Where we see really big buy-in and we see a level of excitement, there's much more clarity within the school about what people are trying to achieve and where the learners are on their journey towards that. So again, if you can rethink your process of planning professional learning, and actually you can see this goes more widely than simply professional learning and actually impacts on all sorts of other areas, then this sort of process is very important. So I've just had a question. Let me just have a quick look. Would you see leveraged coaching as part of this process? Sean, are you talking about the sort of Doug Lemoff type approaches to coaching, using Teach Like a Champion? When you're saying leveraged coaching, what do you mean by that? Just waiting for Sean's answer. Coaching, broadly speaking, just to anticipate what explanation is going to be from Sean, coaching is a really important process. I think it's a really important process when it's transferring expertise and leadership to teachers. So what we don't like to see is people who call themselves coaches who are actually coming in making judgments on behalf of teachers, telling them what they need to do, and then not giving them the tool to understand if they've improved or not. That can be problematic. Okay, I will see if Sean comes back with a little more detail on that question. So that's the sort of process that we're looking for. Everything starting with a real vision for what learners are going to achieve and what great teaching looks like in relation to that. Giving teachers quite a lot of power to identify where are the areas that as a school you need to work on. What I'm not saying here is you necessarily need to give all teachers choice of just do anything, because of course what we lose then is a systematic process. And what we need to see are school development plans that are linked to some quite clear threads. And where we see some really powerful work, it's where the staff collectively have identified some big issues that they all want to solve together. For example, a primary school where literacy was going to be a key focus, and all staff, teaching assistants, teachers, and indeed a few support staff in some cases were involved in the lesson study type approach, where everybody was identifying these. Briefings were used to share ideas, staff room displays were used to share research. All these sorts of ideas came together in one really central mission for the whole school to improve their practice in this area. So that's where we see these things can be very systematic. That said, sometimes in some schools adding a bit of choice in can be really important. In particular, we see some issues where more experienced members of staff are being given repeated professional development when they don't, when they perhaps experienced it before, or it's not so relevant for them. Okay, Sean's come back to me, identifying the levers for change, identifying the specific aspects to change, and then using support from key individuals. I've seen it used based on Teach Like a Champion research and Uncommon Schools in America. Yeah, of course, I mean, some of these things, Sean, can be really effective. I think, for me, the key here, and actually when you see Doug Lemov speak about this, this is also key for him as well. What we mustn't do with this process is simply identify an aspect we deem the teacher's practice to be falling short, and then say, read about this practice and mimic that practice. What we really need them to do is understand, first of all, look at the students and their reactions in your class, look at an expert, and then look at how their reactions are different. Let's understand what we're trying to achieve with these students. Now that we've identified the issues for those students, let's try and adopt this approach and use a coaching model where we can perhaps model and then try and repeat and work on this approach, always focusing on those student outcomes. So as long as we keep that thread of what are we trying to achieve to students and constantly building up that teacher's ability to identify the impact they're having. So great coaching always does this, and they're always asking the participants in the video coaching or the coaching to say, what are you seeing and how do you see that? Okay, well, can you see this as well? Let's compare it to another video where I taught the lesson. What do we see as a difference here? And they're really building up the teacher's ability to formatively assess their own impact, as well as potentially doing some modeling. Now, you can use that sort of coaching with a lesson study model. So, for example, the teachers might do some diagnostic work. They might bring some videos to the expert coach. The expert coach might then identify with them and say, well, what are you seeing in this? What are the problems you're seeing? Well, that's interesting because I think I'm also seeing this. What do you think that means? How might we overcome that? Okay, so you've tried this lesson. Maybe I'll try and model a 10-minute section of the lesson, and let's see what impact that has. And through that, you can see how a coaching strategy can help lesson study. There's a big caveat there. That expert facilitator really needs to be a co-learner. What you don't want is those teachers to think, well, I might as well not inquire about this, just tell me the answer. Sean's just come back and said, I think lesson study seems a stronger strategy. It's more focused on the individual teacher identifying rather than being told things to improve. Yes, I think so, Sean. Where lesson study falls short, it's where teachers are really not very good at diagnosing the issues in their classroom and they're not very self-aware. And at that point, you really do need someone to support and challenge them. Also, potentially, we see teachers who are trying to adopt really bad strategies and non-evidence-based strategies, and you do need someone potentially to help them do that. or simply a group of teachers using this model where actually they're not getting on very well with each other and they actually need somebody to coach them to work with each other. It's a very unusual process for most of us in schools to be co-planning, co-observing, because we just don't do it very often. So I think they've both got their advantages and disadvantages. Certainly lesson study won't give you very quick fixes, but they should give you deeper fixes in the long run. So think about when you're planning your CPD program, what impact are you trying to achieve? It's perfectly reasonable to have some things which are just to communicate, but bearing in mind it's very easy to do those and not have any impact. Try and reduce them. Belief is a really important thing. It's perfectly reasonable to have sections of your CPD program which are there for inspiration, but then you need to have follow-up. You need to say, how can I actually design my further CPD program to develop and focus and embed these ideas. We want to avoid superficial practice change like the plague. Unfortunately, our schools are filled with it in many cases. People like to magpie ideas and not really engage with them deeply. To be honest, that's as much fault of us as teachers, I think, as it is when we're designing CPD programs. When we look at the adoption of these ideas, it can also be really important that we build in systems to make them happen, but don't assume because the system's there, they're happening well. And we often see great issues from senior leadership team who say, well, look, I've done training on it, the systems are in place, why aren't teachers doing it? And that's because maybe the belief that it never happened, and possibly because people didn't really become skillful in it. And finally, whatever you do, begin with the outcome in mind. If you're going to implement a new strategy, try a new approach, start with the outcomes, and feel free, even though you think, well, actually, I'd like every student to benefit from this. Let's pick 2 or 3 students, let's pick 2 or 3 cohorts we're going to really focus on, make it work for them, and then look at others and see, well, is it working for these other groups? But zooming in can actually give you much more impact. Okay, so that really covers everything we also need to know about evaluation. Start with the end in mind, build in the diagnostics, help teachers identify the problems. As teachers, we can consistently think they know what the problem is. If you tell them, oh, the student is doing well enough on that, they'll often come with a sort of a vague idea and go, oh, I think I just need to do this well, or I need to do a better starter, or oh, I don't think they were paying attention, or something like that. You do need to challenge the way teachers think about this in a very supportive, developmental way, but sometimes we need to help teachers think again, see through the eyes of the children in the class. It can be very inspiring and exciting, and in fact, I was working with a teacher recently, and she said she's just done 2 cycles of lesson study, and she said, genuinely, I feel I've learned more about what's actually happening in my classroom and how to be a great teacher in these 2 cycles than I think I've ever had in my last 16 years of teaching. And I think that's quite exciting. So evaluation, we're not really thinking, let's figure out an effect size. We're not really thinking, if I can prove this made GCSE grades go up by 1. That's just not possible statistically from the sorts of things we're doing. What we're looking at is helping the participants formatively evaluate what they're doing, understand the impact they're having, what should I see, what should happen, but also using some measures like, surveys, common tests across the school, which can then they're not for summative, they're not for senior leaders, they're for those teachers to then discuss together, what are we seeing, let's break them down, let's analyse. So real ownership by participants. So finally, because I know we're coming right near the end of the session now, facilitators. So here is a few sort of sneak findings from our new research summary, which is out next month. This is how you might wish to use your fellows, but also other members of expert staff. First of all, we need to think about, if someone's going to be a great facilitator, they need to know certain things in order to be really effective. The first thing they need to know is, how do students develop? So, for example, if it's a physics teacher, do they understand the common misconceptions that students have as they're learning forces, as they're learning electric circuits, as they're learning about light? If they know that, and they know how students build up mental models and where they might go wrong, they're much more likely to help other teachers to understand that learning journey. Also, how do students more broadly, how do they develop, how does their thinking develop, how does their attitudes develop as they grow older? That's really important. But then also teachers. We know the best facilitators know more about how teachers develop their expertise. They'll understand this impact-focused model. They'll understand more about coaching. So those are the first 2 things, how pupils learn, how teachers learn. The next thing is, of course, we need facilitators to understand the research evidence. Now, that's not simply saying, oh, do they know what best practice is? We need them to be quite critical. We need them to say, this is what the research suggests, and this is how strongly it suggests it. So is there agreement, is there disagreement or not? Do your facilitators know the sorts of tools and assessments that they can use and participants can use to figure out if they're making a difference or not yet? If they're improving, trying to help someone with behavior, do they know a multitude of strategies to identify if the behavior is improving? Can they pass those on? Again, teachers, can they observe teachers well? Do they understand the confidence levels of teachers? Are they good at asking teachers the right questions to understand where they're going? And this coaching skills and dispositions are really, really important. And it really isn't just a skill. I've seen someone, I've met people who can describe to me beautifully what coaching is. When you see them, they immediately turn into people who are what I would call their judgmental ring. So really, they're incredibly judgmental. They're actually telling people things. They're not giving them a chance to build up their own capacity. They're not letting them be reflective. And it's very, very easy to do that, particularly the people who get excited intellectually about some of the material. So what do facilitators then need to do? If that's what they know, what do they need to do? So it's a bit like great teaching, actually. And if you really help facilitators think, what would you do with older students as you're really helping them become more independent? So yes, there'll be a bit of sage on the stage, me telling you things and modeling things, but increasingly it will be moving to the side, helping them, challenging them, nipping in, nipping out to help them with that process. Transferring responsibility over. You want your teachers to be independent learners. The last thing you want in your school is a whole bunch of teachers who are not really paying attention. We also really need to look at metacognition. It turns out it's really important to constantly challenge teachers and saying, well, how effectively do you think you're learning this? What have you learned? What are the barriers for you? How are you feeling about this? Because actually teachers' emotional state can be quite important here. Other ideas, making sure that it's not only about here's a really good technique, but how does this relate to the subject you are teaching and the students you are teaching. So really help them understand the students and the subject. And then again, and I'm saying these same things again in many different ways, how can you help the teacher understand what it's like as a student in their class? The more they can do that, the more they can read those pupils effectively, the more they select the right teaching techniques. And coach, support, and challenge. So those are the key ideas. My last little plea to you really is the sorts of things that I really think we have to see coming to an end in schools, and training people by telling them things, teaching teachers to mimic practices without thinking about how they're working, going in with clipboards and telling someone they're outstanding or good because of what's been observed, which really has very little relation to the learning in many cases, progress per lesson, data as telling you everything even though it doesn't necessarily tell you qualitatively. These are all big issues that actually get in the way of really effective professional development. Accountability. I've been in a school recently where teachers are doing this triple marking, and the only reason they're really doing it is because they think Ofsted want to see it. These are all things that get in the way. If you then try and do CPD when that's going on, teachers will resent you, and probably quite rightly. And then all these inefficient meetings. So that's our session today. You can find out more at our website, the Teacher Development Trust. That's tdtrust.org. There's plenty more resources. Do sign up for our newsletter on there. We do have a network of schools who are trying to improve their practice in this area. We've got 120 schools across England and Wales, all sorts of primary, secondary, academy, a few private, some special schools, all sorts of different schools. So you can find out more on our website about that. And finally, if you are looking for external experts and courses used in the right way, we do have a TripAdvisor for CPD, which is our goodcpdguide.com. So there's my contact details. That is today's session. Ultimately, I want to leave with you the idea that the sorts of powerful professional development I've really been describing have been shown clearly to help the children and young people succeed, but also help your teachers thrive and really love their work. And you can tell when your teachers, their eyes light up and they're really enjoying their work. And that gives you generally the same thrill as it does when you do the same with children. So let's try and do that, and let's try and improve our processes. Now, if you do have any questions, please do ping them over now. I'm happy to just hang on a moment and answer any questions. Otherwise, ask your fellows. You can get the contact details. Do have a look on our website and do drop me a line. Thank you very much. As I say, I will hang.
Thank you, David. I can see that some people are saying thank you. So I also wanted to thank you for this really, really interesting and kind of in-depth presentation.
You're very welcome, and as I say, I'm really happy to work with other people on that as well. Thank you, Helen. Thank you. Some nice feedback coming through. I do appreciate it. If anyone has any other sort of questions, as I say, this is your moment to ping them over, or otherwise you're very welcome to email them over to me as well. Elise, I'm going to stop the recording, so we'll come to the end on there, but otherwise I may be stopping the recording. I will still hang around here for a few more minutes, though, so if you do have any questions, I'm still here to help answer those.